All right, we're going to get started with our next panel. Our next panel is what we call an executive provider panel. And we're very pleased to have as moderator for our panel, Bill Berkley. Mr. Berkley is executive chairman for W.R. Berkley Corporation, and he is former chair of the Board of Trustees here at NYU. Bill, thank you very much for being here today and for moderating this panel. I'll let you introduce the panelists.
Why don't you introduce the panelists?
Okay, all right, I'll be happy to do that. To Bill's right, we have Aaron Collins, who's Senior Vice President, State and Policy Affairs for NAMIC Industry Group. We have Fran O'Brien, who is the Chief Risk Officer at Chubb Group. And we have Matt Young, who is head of the property underwriting process for the United States at Swiss Re, the reinsurer. Please proceed.
So one of the interesting issues we face is the understanding that I listened to everyone before this, and they talked wonderfully about the insurance industry, everything about the reality of the business. The reality of the business being you collect premiums from varying participants who need to spread the risk, and insurance companies are the method for spreading the risk amongst exposed participants and avoiding any individual risk that's unforeseen and unacceptable. The difference between those total costs and the premiums is the profit for the insurance company. When costs go up, the premiums need to go up. When costs go up because of individual loss costs or the frequency of loss costs, it results in the need for more premiums. The certainty of that happening is the job that insurance companies face, as well as the estimate of how that's going to happen. When you have changes that come about, such as global warming, the industry is faced with problems that are out of their ordinary course of activity. If there are a few more car accidents, if they're a little more severe, we have data to predict. Global warming is new. It changes the game. And it's not data that our regulators can tell us how to behave with. But they don't want rates to go up. So we're faced with a conundrum. All of us sitting here have to deal with that. So I thought we might start by letting each person express their own view of how global warming is impacting their own activities, because clearly no one knows exactly what global warming is going to mean and how it's going to come out. So.
Sure, thank you. Thanks for having me. Again, my name is Erin Collins. I'm with the National Association of Mutual Insurance Companies. So we are the largest property and casualty trade in the United States with nearly 1,500 member companies. Bill, I think you outlined it well. We generally refer to this dynamic at our organization under the term the new era of risk. We are, as an industry, accustomed to changes in a lot of ways and a lot of spaces, and we always adapt and change to those, and we'll do that here as well. But what we're seeing is a multitude of factors. It's not just climate, it's not just weather. The industry has been well attuned for 200 years at paying attention to the weather. So we are seeing increased severity, and we'll get more into the causes and patterns of that severity. But we're also seeing changes and increases in inflation, which drive loss costs. We're seeing increases and changes in patterns in how and where people go and move in our country. So land use becomes an issue. We have a severe challenge in the litigation system in the United States. So legal system abuse is a major cost driver and something that's controllable, right? So all of those dynamics, and then you combine that with the fact that the reinsurance industry is not immune from any of those dynamics either. So the relative capital and capacity in the industry creates another challenge when you overlay that with our regulatory system that is not built with the same level of speed at which we are seeing some of these dynamics, inflation, supply chain issues. The average time to get, a rate in force is about 2 years in the United States, from, calculation and formation into making it in force. And that's without the dynamic that the superintendent was talking about artificial suppression. So I think when you combine all of those things together, we are facing a new era of how we talk about risk, and it is more important than ever for us to be partners, not just with each other in the industry, but we strive to be partners with the regulators and consumers or individual policyholders. Insurance companies take incredibly personally and important their relationship to their policyholders and the obligation that they have to those policyholders. And that is deeply impactful in terms of how companies spread and evaluate their risk. So it's definitely a challenge, but I think one that, collectively we can adjust to.
Before we move on, how specifically do you think climate change has made it especially more difficult?
Sure. I think, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, we were talking an awful lot about catastrophe, about cat risk. The term, I did not coin the term, unfortunately, but the term now for smaller storms, but increasing severity in storms is kittens. So the collective impact of attritional loss, non-cat, non-traditional cat related loss has increased over time. Keep in mind, all of those things, it's not just the strength of those storms or those, thunderstorms, hail. It is the population density in those spaces. It is the cost of repair. All of those things are sort of a swirl and a dynamic. So you can't really divorce one from the other. But I think in terms of direct impact to climate, we're seeing it in that space specifically.
Yeah. Well, I agree wholeheartedly with Bill and Aaron. I think it's incumbent, though, that we break it down a little further, because it does differ depending on the risk or peril you're thinking about, and you're trying to insure, and the type of insurance that you're offering. So it's not just like insurance for climate change, right? It's insurance for wildfire versus flood versus hurricane versus severe convective storm versus winter storm versus heat waves, right? All of those have differing impacts on insurance availability and insurance costs, and depending on the coverage you're buying, what the overlap in those perils may be. And then we have, as an insurance company, we also think through not only the current exposure because of that peril and what a very large systemic loss could happen on our portfolio, that we have to not only operationally support our customers by making sure that we have enough claims adjusters to get out there in time and we can start repair as quickly as possible and bring people back. But what are the services that we can provide to help our customers harden against these perils? And what are the advice that we can give them and the towns and the cities that they live in around, what are the things that we can offer as an insurance industry of best practices around mitigating some of the exposure to this risk. And then we have the prospect of, as we work through transition around climate change, transitioning away from oil and gas, what are the products and services needed for, you know, the new energy support, and how can we provide that in order to move that along more quickly? So it's a very broad topic. I think the challenge, if we want to stay in the lane of, you know, increased costs and lack of capacity in the near term, right? And start thinking about all the things that cause that to happen. It is things like the exposure portfolio is much greater than it used to be. A study that was done in 2021, if you look at hurricanes from 1900 to 2021, the 9 of the top most expensive storms, if you overlay the current exposure footprint in the US, would have occurred before 1960. So again, that is part of the issue, not related per se to warming sea surface temperatures, right? So that's one issue. Then you have the issue, as Aaron said, around just increased costs because of macroeconomic factors that have occurred, inflation, supply chain issues. You know, how do you deal with demand surge after big events? And then there is this very, very big uncertainty around how do you model the severity and frequency of storms in your, you know, near-term insurance portfolio based on the climate and the weather that you're going to see. And what are the things that have changed from the history that you have in your, you know, sort of your loss history that you have to identify? And then does the regulatory environment in the places that you want to operate allow you to recognize all of those things and allow you the flexibility to offer coverages or ways for people to mitigate, or services, as you know, our superintendent in New York was talking about. And that is what is driving a lot of the lack of capacity. It's not necessarily climate change per se. It is the ability to recognize that in the way that you build your products, in the way that you price your products, in the way that you build your portfolio and underwrite and service your customers, that causes some of that capacity to come out of the market.
Well, we'll come back to that. It's not necessarily climate change, but climate change adds a layer of uncertainty in a marketplace that faces all of the other things you said. And no one really knows what climate change is going to do, and which is part of the problem. Why don't we move ahead before we?
Sure. So one of the things I saw in the first presentation was on your slide, you had showed from the survey that insurers look to their reinsurers for education on the climate change topic. And that's kind of the first thing I think of when you ask the question, how are we addressing it? So I'm responsible for property treaty underwriting in the US. So if you're not familiar with that term, treaty reinsurance is reinsurance of entire portfolios as opposed to reinsurance of a single risk. And what we try to do separate of our reinsurance placements and reinsurance negotiation is the education piece, the research papers and thought leadership, because it is something that Swiss Re is committed to. So that's one thing that we do try to meet that expectation from our clients. I think the other piece, we do our own modeling, whether it's earthquake modeling or hurricane modeling or severe convective storm modeling. And I mention that because that's kind of our way of bringing the forward-looking view into the picture. So all the science that we take from the education and the research papers and the thought leadership we do, trying to turn that into some quantitative terms of, okay, what does that actually mean in real life? What does it mean to the vulnerability of structures? What does it mean to the type of events that will come? Just one example. So when we look at hurricane risk in the New York area, we tend to bring stronger storms further north and further inland than maybe some others. And like Fran said, I mean, that's kind of a view towards some of the worst hurricanes, or maybe I should say all of the worst hurricanes that we've seen haven't happened in recent history. So thinking about, you know, how bad can it be? That's really what we're trying to predict. And then the last piece, I think, with climate change, I think we have to talk about kind of capital deployment or capital allocation. And maybe I'll just address the idea up front that the insurance industry as a whole is kind of running away from this risk, and I think it's absolutely false. I see that the hundreds of insurance companies that we work with are trying their absolute hardest to address it. And we don't have companies that are saying, I want to non-renew my portfolio because of this climate risk. Nobody wants to non-renew their portfolio. Everybody wants to grow, but we have to figure out how to do it in a way that's sustainable, like Superintendent Harris had talked about. Insurance companies have to make money to continue to be a going concern. And I think sometimes maybe we're afraid to say that, but if we want to have a competitive, healthy insurance industry, they need to be on solid financial footing and making money. So on the climate risk and capital deployment at Swiss Re, we have kind of run towards this risk, but we do it in a way that where we're trying to understand it. Do we know how bad things can be? We try. We take all of our science, all the knowledge we have, and say, all right, this is our prediction for what's going to happen in the future. And then when that happens, we say, okay, we test that against what we anticipated. It's like, okay, were we right or were we wrong? And we adjust. But main point being, climate change does not cause a withdrawal of capital solely because of climate change. I think kind of fits in with what Aaron said.
So I think that one of the issues that needs to be addressed, though, is not to throw climate change away, but in a world where what's put upon the insurance industry is to try to bring these things into focus, and climate change, which we're all sort of saying is the world we live in, but no one's saying, how do we take it into consideration? And how do we get the data we need to allow us to avoid the kind of really insurance catastrophe we had in California? How do we do that? What do we do? And how do we start to gather that data and deal with the regulator and the industry to meet the needs of these customers? And what do we do about the cost? Because the cost clearly is a real increase in cost, which is the issue California thought they could basically tell the insurance business, too bad, which didn't work out. Now, what are some of the kinds of solutions we can see for those issues? Who'd like to go first?
I'll start.
It just shows you that you made a mistake.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, go ahead.
Everybody else can correct where I start. I think the first thing, if say I think about California, we have to separate insurance risk from affordability or social issues. I think that's the first piece. They go together, but by confusing the idea that we're going to kind of suppress rates or not take a forward-looking view into account, I think is confusing kind of what the purpose of insurance is for, almost. Insurance rates have to keep pace with risk. And if there's another mechanism to deal with the affordability, that I think is a separate issue. You kind of open the door.
Before we go
Yeah.
past that, what does everybody else think about that?
I agree with that to a large extent. I think, you know, in terms of insurance principles and dynamics, we often talk about the concept of moral hazard. And when we can have policies create a false sense amongst the pool, the insurance pool, of what the risk is, and that creates potentially moral hazard. And historically, we've talked a lot about that concept in the auto line. So an easy example is there's a reason why you are not indemnified from running someone down with your car, right? And that would create a moral hazard on multiple ends of the spectrum. You can see the corollary here in the context of climate change. If we divorce the concept of real insurance risk, what it really means from a politicization perspective, from a regulatory perspective, then fundamentally the markets and potential insureds and current insureds will not recognize what their risk truly is, and behavior will follow. So we have to be careful, very much so, of not recognizing what our insurance risk is. So insurance industry and companies work very hard at using technology and new dynamics, new modeling, to try to understand what that risk is. And we need to ensure that there are not components that restrict that information flow down to consumers. So we want to make sure that regulators are our partner in that conversation, not suppressing that conversation. So by example, California is just now starting a regulatory process to allow cat modeling. We have to empower the use of information and data in order to make sure that we're insuring appropriately and that consumers are a part of that conversation.
Yeah, I would agree with both what Matt and Aaron have put forward, and I do agree that separating, affordability from insurance availability is empowering and trying to solve the problem of both, almost, right? Because you can come up with things like, if in order to have more capacity and you need to attract more capital into the insurance marketplace, you need to be able to generate appropriate profits off of that, right? And if that then creates a world where you have more competition, right, it's a benefit per se to the affordability question. The affordability question is broader, right? It's going to take understanding the risk better, more granularly. It's going to take working with cities and towns to harden their stock of housing and infrastructure and that sort of thing. Is going to take regulators working through how you deal with those risks that are deemed, way too expensive to be able to insure, right? Like, so how do we deal with that? So I do think separating the two from the perspective of tackling the problem is somewhat empowering. But the bottom line, if nobody can afford to buy your product, you're not a going concern, right? So it's.
Go ahead, continue, I interrupted you.
So I'm gonna go on the mitigation piece. I mean, the insurance industry, as well as our partners, have invested and will continue to invest a lot into the mitigation. And maybe there's probably more of a question here, but I think it's just important to point out when we talk about insurance, it's not just about the risk and the rates and everything going up. We can counteract that with mitigation. I don't want to go too deep in the topic yet, but education is just such a huge piece that I don't think the industry does particularly well. When we say, what's in it for me on the mitigation side. So maybe I'll pause there and we can come back to it if we.
Yeah, I would agree with that, but we need partners in that conversation, right? I mean, we need to have real thought and energy as a country and as a global community about financial literacy, and that includes the concept of insurance. The question, I didn't see a lot of hands when the superintendent asked how many people read their policy. And we are people interested in the topic, right? And when you extrapolate that out to us as a population, very few people understand how their risk is being transferred, what of their risk is being transferred, and what components go into that dynamic. So it's very difficult to then have harder conversations about what we do about land use and about hardening and mitigation and everyone's role in that process. If we aren't starting from a place of financial literacy in the insurance context.
So I keep trying to get us back to the issue of data and global warming, which is clearly having an impact. All you have to do is look at wildfires, frequency of, as you say, kittens. I hadn't heard that before. And things are changing, and we don't have data for it. Even though we have lots of new methods for mining data. How do we start down that course, and how do we do it working with regulators? So, as I say, I've been in this business more than 50 years, and I've never seen such a catastrophe as we saw in California this past year. Just total blind behavior by a regulator. How do we avoid that, and how do we get the data to start to march together?
Well, I think Aaron brought this up, that there's, I mean, there exists historical models that are very helpful, right, in trying to understand and measure the risk, you know, against your portfolio. And, you know, and they're structured from the perspective of like, here is your portfolio's location in respect to the hazard. It then looks at what the building stock and physical risk looks like from a construction perspective. What would change if that construction was retrofitted to something better. It allows you to play with frequency and severity of events. And so you can get what I'll say is a measurement, which then you can stress test and say, well, if this, you know, if this is off by this much, this is a sensitivity to each of the parts of the equation, and you can apply your insurance terms and conditions against it, so you can see like what the impact ends up being financially on your portfolio, right? And this is something that, you know, Aaron was talking about in California, just starting to allow using models to think about what the current exposure is and what, you know, could happen over the near term. And then what that means from the perspective of like what the costs would need to be, what you would need to think about operationally and that sort of thing. And those models exist, and they have a lot of uncertainty in them. I'm not going to say that they're perfect, but they're a very good starting point to get, you know, get a mental model together around what are the inputs and sensitivity. So when I, as an insurance company, think about the capital that I'm going to put at risk and the coverage that I'm going to offer, it allows me to have a better understanding of the repercussions of insuring the portfolio that I have in hand or that I may want to insure.
Do we need a TRIA type program for the unforeseen magnitude of an event, given global warming?
My response to that is no. I think traditionally we have seen, you know, residual market pools in the states not work terribly well because of the political component. From a federal component, we have seen similar challenges with the flood program where there's an interaction there. In terms of a form like TRIA, I think that the challenge is it's designed toward the wrong thing. There's not a direct corollary between terrorism risk and what we face in weather risk. And I think that you can't compare the two in terms of frequency and severity. So I don't think that, from my personal opinion, that's not a model that works. I think we're better served Matt alluded to this, and actually said it outright, but I think we're better served as a collaboration between industry and government in bending the curve of loss. And how do we do that? And so, no, I don't think a platform like that is the right way to do that. I think we're better served on working towards community hardening at scale.
I would agree with that.
Same here. I also think back to your question on the data, it depends what kind of data we're talking about. We have tremendous amounts of climate data and we have tremendous amounts of loss data. As long as maybe rate setting is focused on historical loss data, we might be behind the curve. So that's where the forward-looking piece has to enter into the picture. So we can combine the climate data with all the risk characteristic data that Fran talked about and actually project forward rather than just looking to the past. So if that's what you mean by we don't have the data, we don't have the forward-looking aspect in the historical loss data. And that's where we need to take a step forward.
Yeah, but we also don't have historical data on what climate change is going to do because it's still constantly changing as water temperatures are changing, as the ice caps are changing. So climate change in and of itself is changing. So it's a bit more complicated than most trend lines that we would look at. So it's the question is, how severe is it going to be? But certainly some of it would require activity. How do we work better with regulators who unfortunately think a big part of their job is to keep rates suppressed? Not to use that word, is that what they would say, but it is what they do. Except in New York, of course.
A great deal of my job and time is spent working with regulators, and they do differ in their approaches to their individual state markets, and we are big believers in state-based regulation at NAMIC and in the US and supportive of that because we believe that risk is local, and so therefore the regulation should be local. I think that helping regulators understand the reality of what we're faced with as a global or domestic community is an important conversation. I think most of them recognize it. I think working together to ensure that all the levers that there are to pull that Matt referenced, right? All the power of the data, all the power of the technology, all of those things can be in place and enforced. That type of shift in innovation has to be fostered. That has to be a joint communication and conversation with the industry and regulators, because innovation does cost money, and it costs money not just in terms of the technology that's required, but also an investment in future generations of people coming into this industry. I've yet to meet, and we have discussed this, so you may be my first. I've yet to meet an industry professional who says, when I was 5 years old, I wanted to grow up and work in insurance. I think that, I have an 11-year-old, and the thing adults ask him the most is, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I read a statistic last year that 30% of kids under the age of 18 will grow up to have a job that doesn't exist yet. And I think that his age group is right for steering towards things like data science, steering towards things like, climate science, mathematics. I hope he takes more after Fran in that reign than me, because math was not my strong suit. But I do think that, we have to work collaboratively with regulators towards innovation and data use and technology. So not just allowing for the things that already exist, but fostering a community of trying to strive towards improvements in that area. And that remains a challenge before us, but that's the conversation I continue to have.
How do the industry works well with the NAIC and
Can someone turn their phone off, please?
and industry groups? I think you know, as Bill said, there's regulators and there's regulators, right? Not everybody's the same. Some of the regulatory positions are political, you know, you have to be elected. And they're stepping stones to bigger political office, and that always creates an interesting dynamic. And so I think that's something part of the challenge, right? Is like if you're regulating a state with a very difficult problem who's seeing, you know, much bigger impact from climate change or severe weather. Then and you have political aspirations and you're worried about the real estate market in your state and being you know, affordable and that sort of thing. It becomes a bigger issue than I need people to be able to afford insurance, right? And I think that's a challenge.
I would just add, as a reinsurer, our interactions with regulators are maybe a little bit different. But I would not paint a broad brush with regulators. Some states are certainly more challenging than others. I've done a lot of work in the flood insurance space, which is a clear need that's already been highlighted today. And I find the interactions extremely welcoming, very collaborative. And that probably characterizes the vast majority of interactions. So I'd just add that I think regulators are quite receptive to ideas.
Yeah.
Certainly
Well,
depends on the
but since you were so kind to bring up flood insurance was okay, these people are stuck there, we'll provide them insurance. And now your house can be washed away by a flood and we'll pay for you to rebuild it in the same place. Effectively, a subsidy from the government, which is something we went away from when it was started. We aren't addressing the issues that we're talking about, which is, as I say, climate, but others, and that is this ever increasing cost of affordable insurance put on top of the issue of greater uncertainty with climate change. So if you go up to Rhode Island, this winter, the highest tide was 3 feet higher than it was in any previous winter in the past 25 years. What does that mean? What does it do? What do people talk about rates? And how does that impact what we do as insurers? And is it related to climate? Is it not? And how do we start to make progress? Because flood insurance, in fact, as it's now contemplated, doesn't work. Big multi-billion-dollar annual losses, basically paid for by the government, which will end, and then you'll have another crisis. So how do we try to get ahead of that curve so everything doesn't become like flood insurance?
Sure.
Well, I have two things. I think, and I don't, somebody that's worked in politics for 25 years, I'm not being Pollyanna-ish when I say this, but I think we have to have real conversations in public policy context where insurance is not the politically expedient target of reform. So it can be easier for a regulator who's politically minded or a more traditionally elected policymaker to say, well, insurance has to do this or insurance has to fix this, rather than having a broader conversation about land use. Those are harder and less politically expedient conversations to have, but that's how we do it. That's how we have to address that. We can't rebuild the same home in the same place over and over and over and over again, being destroyed by one of these perils. We also there's made mention of the migration of our population in the United States. I heard a reinsurer say this past year, not Matt or Matt's company, but a reinsurer said to me, if we were to design as a country a plan of what would be the worst places to go for risk and representation, that is where our population is flocking to. And so we need to have real conversations about that, including in our own families, you know, in terms of, you know, we all have, you know, parents who may be looking for warmer climates. Well, where are those warmer climates? And what is the risk associated with that population move? So what circling back to my first point, we have to have broader public policy conversations about the tough topics and about the real drivers of these costs, and not just the back end of, you know, what's the insurance role in that conversation.
And I agree, but I would just bounce back to, you know, Bill's point about flood, which is, so first of all, climate change, and there's a lot of academic literature that supports that heavier moisture in the atmosphere. So you hear about atmospheric rivers now, and you get these rainfalls that are crazy. That is resulting from climate change. And the challenge with the National Flood Insurance Program and the lack of a private flood market is that it's based off of flood maps that are out of date. It's based off of really fluvial overflow of a body of water. It's not great coverage. We keep rebuilding in the same place. It's going to flood over and over. And you have, you know, essentially set up a world where whenever you buy a house, your attorney and your real estate person tells you the great news is you don't have to buy flood. That's like the number one thing they say to you when they show you a house. Meanwhile, and I think even today, earlier, somebody said about 20% of the population needs flood insurance. Given the current moisture in the atmosphere and the rainstorms you're seeing, you all need flood insurance. And I'm not just saying this because I want to sell it to you, but you all need flood insurance to deal with inundation. You know, we talked about the ability for, you know, our infrastructure to absorb that heavy rainfall the way that it can't. It's not. We see it over and over again, which is why we have not only, you know, these storm surge from hurricanes, but you have in places where people think are not going to flood, flooding to a great extent more often. And, you know, it is something that needs to be worked out from the perspective of what is the NFIP's role, what is FEMA's role, what can the private industry bring to the table, and, you know, how do we deal with the land use to solve this problem that is, you know, coming from the current climate conditions.
And I would just add on to that, maybe adoption of building codes.
Yeah.
It's a big area. We know building codes work. Florida approves building codes work among other states. And yet roughly half the states in the US don't have a statewide building code. That might be overstating the issue because there's municipalities that have building codes, but still, point being, we know they're effective. Yet, like Erin said earlier, it takes a tremendous collaboration with partners, not just public policymakers, home builders and realtors, and it goes on from there. I also heard this morning, I think up here, mention of fortified homes from the IBHS, which is a step beyond building codes, but we also know that's effective. And just one quick story, there was a CFO of a small Louisiana insurance company whose own home was damaged after Hurricane Ida. And he knew about the IBHS fortified home and said, I want to rebuild my home to those standards. But he couldn't find a contractor who was up to speed on fortified homes. So when he found a contractor, he actually got them to go through the training. It was an online training, and he paid the contractor to do it. And so he said, okay, I'm up to speed on fortified standards. Then they had to find the parts, like the clips and everything, and they couldn't find them at a building supplier in Louisiana. He had to drive to Alabama. So he paid his builder, who had now spent time becoming fortified certified, to drive to Alabama to get the special pieces, which really weren't that special. They just weren't stocked in Louisiana, to finally repair his home. I mean, there's so much opportunity to make relatively small changes that have a really big impact, but it comes down to education.
Yeah, I can't echo that enough. I mean, these aren't Jetson era materials we're talking about here, right? I mean, we're talking about which way your front door opens. We're talking about ring-shaped nails that go into the roof. These things have real, tangible impact at IDHS that show us where at 100-mile-an-hour winds, the only house left standing is the one that has, you know, like virtually about $1,000 worth of retrofitted material to it. So I mean, those are ways to bend the curve, and I think you know, consumer demand will drive that, but that's back to education and communication. And I think historically the industry has done a tremendous job in the auto space and auto safety. I mean, you know, in the 80s, it wasn't much of a going concern what your safety was in your automobile, and now it's usually one of the first things people think about or look at in picking a new vehicle. So I think we can work towards driving that consumer demand, but we do have to have partners in the building industry to be able to do that.
So you think we have all the data we need and we don't need to do anything more with climate data, and you all are happy? But nobody's telling me we should do something different.
Would be nice.
Yeah, I mean,
Like, you know, it would be nice to see the future.
this is still a product at its core, which a premium is collected without the true cost of the implementation of the product being known. So there is no crystal ball to look at it. So you know, but there is so much data and analysis available and to be had, and new and smarter ways of looking at that data happen every day. So I think it's, you know, it's the power is yet to be fully unleashed there.
But what do we do? I mean, you told me it's there to at least, but these people are here for us to tell them what we're gonna do to help solve this problem.
I think we have got to bend the curve of loss down. That is the biggest thing that we can do.
So reduce the losses.
Yes, absolutely. We can't change the weather. You know, I think hardening of communities, both at an individual and an at scale level, has to be something that we do, and it has to go further than just anti-rebating reform where you can put water sensors in your homes. It has to be a full-throated effort and conversation to change how communities approach risk. And the insurance industry is there and has participated. You know, the industry is the largest purchaser of municipal bonds in the country. The premium tax is typically the second highest form of income for every state in the nation, except those that don't have income tax. So I think, you know, the opportunities are there, but the biggest partner we can be as an industry in adapting to climate change is to bend the cost down.
Which I agree with that. I mean, yeah, we would love the data for the future. We'll continue to collect climate data. We'll continue to collect loss data. We'll continue to learn. I mean, that's the insurance industry is so innovative. I think oftentimes people look at the insurance industry and say it's staid, it's slow, it's boring. It's not. The innovation that we see on the risk side, and the risk modeling side, and the risk assessment side. When I said I'm thinking particularly of wildfire risk. And the work that's been done there to understand the risk, to understand mitigation, is really, really fascinating. All of that work, though, to understand the risk, there's one thing we can do to change that risk, and that's the mitigation. I mean, the insurance industry, like I said earlier, does not want to non-renew their book. They don't want to increase rates to the point where it becomes unaffordable and folks won't buy their insurance. The insurance industry is tremendously competitive. But the one thing we can do is focusing on actually lowering the loss.
Nobody answered the question, though. I mean, the issue is we see changes that have taken place. wildfires, frequency of kittens, frequency of smaller storms. Lots more rainfall in some places and less in others. But a climate pattern that doesn't exactly follow historic climate patterns. How and what do we do to try to keep ahead of the curve? And how do we start a process that's inventing ISO for new data? Because ISO now, having been so big and whatever, or should I not call it ISO and call it VERISC? But whatever it may be, are we moving fast enough, given how fast things are changing? And if we're not, what do we do? We're not changing it. It doesn't seem we're changing fast enough for the pace of change that we have to adjust to.
Well, I think, at least from my perspective, there are different levels of speed that are not built for the traditional regulatory community for the industry. So even if the data, the analysis, the risk modeling, even if all of that is moving fast enough, we can debate whether or not that's true. I'm not sure there's such a thing as fast enough when we're talking about risk. I think you empower as many levers and opportunities as you can to work as hard as you can in that space. But I don't know that there's ever a time where you just go, yep, we've figured it out. I think you go as hard at that as you can. But when we're seeing speed of change and things like inflation that aggravate that speed, and then you talk about speed to market being so divergent from that curve, I think what we can do is make sure that we are anticipating as much as we can the dynamics that exacerbate that climate change, like inflation, like supply chain issues, like litigation abuse. We can slow that curve down. Those are concerted things that we can do from a public policy perspective. And then on the other end, we have to look at our regulatory frameworks and how we allow companies to adjust to that speed. The regulatory system in that respect is too slow.
So Chubb is amongst the biggest insurers in the world. You're faced with these issues every day. How are you adjusting to all these changes? What are you doing?
Are you trying to get some competitive information, Bill?
Absolutely.
I mean, listen, as part of our risk management program, we do look at, we spend a lot of time on the near-term horizon, the 3 to 5 years out, less time beyond that, because there's just the uncertainty continues to get bigger the further out you go. But it is about, do you have the best data? It's working with, we have academic partnerships, we work with industry groups, talk to regulators, trying to understand the science, using new technology to, tend to see what the impact of that would be. And, essentially, the speed is, if you break it down between, what do you know, or what do you think you know that's going to happen, and then what you can then do about it. That's where I think it starts, as Aaron is saying, that's when you start to see like, okay, I know this now, I can do this quickly, this will take longer, this will take even longer. And so then therefore, what do I have to do now in order to continue to meet my strategic goals and support my shareholders and that sort of thing, which is why you see what happened in California over the last couple of years happen, right? Because of the disconnect between the speed of each of those pieces. And we still, we intend to be a big property writer where we just launched a new product called Climate Plus, which is, supporting products and services that support the transition risks. And we continue to look for ways to help our clients be more hardened, whether that's through services or technology or different coverages that they can buy.
So if I were to be sitting here, I would be saying, we're gonna have these changes and we're gonna react as opposed to be proactive. And is that really the best we can do? So if we wanted to be proactive, different, because it's a different kind of change than we've seen, what could we do that would put us in a more proactive position? Given the world of artificial intelligence and all the technologies that are available to us, how would you be proactive? Swiss Re, one of the global giants of the reinsurance business, how would you be more proactive?
Yeah, and I don't know that I would say that I agree with, we're gonna be reactive and we're not being proactive. I think we're being proactive by all the research we do, by conversations like this, we're really thinking about it. And by not just saying it's climate change, there's nothing we can do about it. And I think the climate change conversation has actually led to, it's led to a great deal of understanding of risk of what is happening in the future, what could happen, how bad could it be. I think it also goes to where Erin had started with some of her comments. Not everything is climate change. I think the climate change conversation has led us back to fundamentals of insurance. Losses exacerbated by inflation, by concentration risk. I think that's one other important topic we haven't talked about is some of the maybe more impressive or more urgent innovations I've seen in the insurance space have less to do with pricing and more to do with understanding where my concentrations are. Because if I have an uncertain future and I don't know what the price ultimately should be, what I can control is where my risks are located. How bad could it potentially be? I think that's a piece that's been missing from the conversation so far, and a concrete idea for how insurance companies can kind of address the mitigation without either mitigation for the physical property or like the pricing conversation.
So you are saying something different now. And that is, you're saying you won't write business that's in major exposure to climate change.
I would actually not say that at all. We have at Swiss Re, we actually are finding property cat business very attractive and are taking on that risk. And I think oftentimes when you make a comment like we're running away from climate risk, we think hurricane, and we have a tremendous hurricane book. And we're actually pretty confident in our view of that hurricane risk, among other perils. I would focus on maybe something like severe convective storm. And when I'm thinking concentration, of course, that applies to all perils. Some of the worst losses we've seen have been with small insurance companies and SCS losses, where there was a kind of a lack of concentration analysis. So I think this idea, and for severe convective storm, we would point more to urbanization, inflation, changing vulnerability for what's impacting those losses more than climate change.
I would agree. I think in general, the industry is trying to be proactive to the extent they can. You can't survive very long in the environment without thinking forward a little bit. And figuring out how to manage your portfolio appropriately and the capital that needs to support it. I think that also, while we saw a capacity leave the market, the property market in the US, over the course of, started probably in 2018 after the California wildfires, and we're really dipped in 2022, 23. And now you're starting to see capacity, even the capital markets have returned. They sort of left starting in 2022, 2023. They're start coming back in with cat bonds and that sort of thing. So you are starting to see much more, the industry in a more aggressive stance at writing more property business than they had been previously. As some issues have sort of resolved themselves around, and it's not related to climate change per se, but it's like and I say per se because certainly the supply chain, you heard about it this morning, getting goods through Panama is a challenge, but the supply chain issues that we saw coming out of the pandemic have somewhat righted themselves. Inflation has moderated, right? So you're starting to see the effects of that, having a more robust property market in the US. And that is in the face of, there's still climate change and extreme weather that we're all trying to measure and figure out how much capacity we can put out there to cover.
One thing I think the industry is proactive on, but we could do better with it, is these things don't happen in a vacuum, right? So the homeowner's line or the property line is not in and of itself a contained unit. Insurance companies have different lines of business. It's part of how they diversify. So new product development and innovation, new consumer demand for micro insurance or insurance of different respects, for different ways to insure existing things or new things to insure. Innovations in the auto line are necessary, but they also change the expense of that line. So I think everything that we can do to proactively evolve, innovate, and address issues in maybe less volatile lines of business or new lines of business will diversify the book overall, for the overall profile of the industry and companies, and allow for some more innovation and smoothing out the curve on the homeowner side. So that's one thing we do, but I think we could do better.
Yes.
I would like to ask a question about the risks from climate change seem to me different from other risks because they're so broad spatially. And so if you have an event, it's likely to be big. And if you don't have an event, you're wealthy. I mean, you have a good year. And so the question, how can you, actually, you said this to me right as I walked out, past you upstairs. This is about risk sharing, and who are we sharing the risks with? I mean, if we're talking about sea level rise, we're sharing it with other people that are right along the coast. Well, that's not actually going to diversify very much. I wondered whether reinsurance is the way that this diversification needs to happen, whether you can reinsure lots of little companies, each of which are not diversified, I suppose, and get the risk sharing in that way. Is that a direction that's going?
Certainly. I mean, what we do is reinsure hundreds of companies, which range from size from county mutuals that write in one county to the likes of the largest companies in the world. We take that risk on within our risk tolerance, and then either pursue retrocession, and I'll kind of speak on behalf of the industry. Some companies do that more than others, where you have capital markets investors, perhaps. Oftentimes what happens, or you can do risk swaps. So maybe Japanese earthquake risk is swapped with Florida hurricane risk. So there's many ways that we kind of ultimately spread out the risk. which is where reinsurance in the market, like Fran had said, of course, kind of everything operates in a cycle. But when you see capacity increasing or decreasing, I mean, in this context, it's easy to say, oh, it's because of climate change. You know, the capacity in the reinsurance market went down. It's actually far more complex than that. It has to do with interest rates and financial markets and all of the above. But yeah, absolutely. That is how I would kind of view our function, is taking that individual risk and spreading it globally.
Yes.
Yeah, can I just go back to some of the discussion here around the impact of climate risk? And I think one of the things we're missing a little bit is time horizon. Because if I'm sitting as an insurance provider, my focus is essentially on a 12-month plus or minus view. I can reprice a lot of my insurance contracts. I'm focused on my quarterly earnings, and I can adjust my portfolio to try and accommodate that. If I'm an asset owner, what I'm really interested in is what's the equity value of my asset that I'm investing in, a commercial property, a piece of real estate. And that question can only be answered if I know what's the secular direction of insurance costs going to be, other things being equal, over the next 10 years or 15 years or 20 years. Is my insurance cost going to be 2% of my asset value? Is it going to be 4%? Is it going to be 5%? That has a huge impact, and that flows through also into capital markets. And that's not necessarily the main focus of an insurance provider, because it's a different time horizon. And I'm just wondering if the panel, if you agree with that, and if so, are there other things that could be done to kind of help clients who have this question think about what the longer term horizon is going to be, not what my risk pricing is for the next 12 months or my next 18 months, but what's the longer term horizon looking like?
I think, at least for me, I would disagree with the assertion or the assumption that insurance companies are primarily focused on the premium policy year, 12 months. I think they have a much longer view than that. I think managing, the only way to manage concentration and diversification is to look at those dynamics from a longer view. I think the science and technology helps us to understand the trajectory of things. But I think insurance companies, mutual insurance companies in particular, in their investment strategies and in their modeling and managing their book, look at a much longer horizon than the policy year. I think we are talking 5-10 years, and that's evidenced by some of our experience over time in managing profit and loss. We don't think of profit and loss in terms of a policy term. We think about it in very long ranges, because we have experiences with things like Hurricane Katrina that can wipe out 20 years of profit in one day. The only way to manage through that is to take a longer view.
I would agree, but on the other side of your question, it is if I could reframe it to make sure that I understand it, if insurance companies know how to measure risk to some extent, given, future uncertainty, how do they make that transparent to their clients so that, clients can be informed buyers, right? And I think, we at Chubb, we do work with our clients. We have risk engineers where we can give them a report on their facilities that says this is what you're exposed to and this is what is happening. And we do that with our homeowners as well. And other companies do the same. That probably could be improved significantly, particularly, with AI technology now, it can scale better, right? It can be more simplified for people to understand. But I do think, I agree with you, there could be more transparency with insurance buyers so they understand the long-term nature of the risk.
I'll give you an example. So I've seen an illustration that was for flood risk, but you could do it for any risk. This product was for large corporates because the costs of doing analysis like this was in the thousands. But you fly a drone over, say, a manufacturing facility, and I can give you a report that says I think your annual expected loss for this facility is whatever, or I can give you a report that says you're in a flood zone A. But those are just words on a page. What this does is capture the terrain using LiDAR and your visual facility. And then takes the sophisticated cat models and says, okay, we're gonna simulate a flooding event, and here's where the water is gonna enter your property, we think. Obviously, that risk can always change, but here's where we think it's gonna enter your property, here's what it would look like in your property. This is, you know, what maybe a 5-year event would be and what a 100-year event could be. So I think, I mean, it gets to the topic of we can try to tell people their risk, or we can really show people their risk, and that's one example.
But I also think you can buy more than 1 year of insurance. You might not be able to buy 10 years. But you can buy more than 1 year of insurance in almost every case. It's price. Yes,
So,
could you identify yourself?
so Casey Hotsuki. I'm Casey Hotsuki from Morgan Stanley, former chief risk officer. And I'm still confused about the source of the challenge about how you can provide sufficient amount of insurance for the demand. And I'm trying to make an analogy here. So a Japanese earthquakes. As a Japanese guy, I know that the demand for earthquake insurance is too high compared to the potential supply, because the risk appetite of insurance company, particularly from Japanese insurance, is not sufficient, from the concentration risk perspective. So the nature of the issue there is that when you do the actual actuarial analysis, you cannot provide enough supply to the demand. Versus in the case like California, like a wildfire, is that the same challenge that in fact the entire appetite that insurance reinsurance has is not sufficient for the demand? Or potentially a different problem is that because of the climate change, the actuarial approach is not sufficient for you to decide how much of the risk you take. The uncertainty of the climate risk is the source of the potential challenge of having the supply.
So, I mean, I can answer that from a reinsurance perspective, and I think it's the last part of what you said. So it's like earthquake or hurricane risk, insurance companies are pretty confident in. So are institutional investors who are investing in collateralized reinsurance or cat bonds, and it's modelable and it's transparent and it's relatively easy understood. So there you see kind of more capital flow into transparent risks. When you get to what we would call secondary perils, which aren't so secondary anymore, there's not the transparency. So you don't have as well developed models. There's more uncertainty. We've seen events recently that kind of potentially reset expectations about how bad these so-called secondary perils could be. So I think that will influence a reinsurer's appetite, but it also has a tremendous effect on the institutional capital that is deployed there, because of maybe some logistical things like, do I have a transparent view of risk that I can say set a bond price on or something, but then also because of the just relative certainty.
I think that there are few things that there isn't enough capacity for at a price. I'm trying to think. TRIA was the only event, and it was because the facts were so unknown at that moment. And eventually even TRIA people got a lot more comfortable with that. Any other questions?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Yes.
I'm Lars Powell at University of Alabama, where we're in the state, we have almost 60,000 fortified homes built now. And as Matt was alluding to, the very hardest fortified home to build is the first one. So my question is, could the insurance industry get behind some sort of incentive for contractors, whether it be a carrot or a stick situation, we're not going to use contractors that don't get certified for fortified roofs or fortified buildings. Is that seems like a very proactive and absent. I know several states have laws against steering your claims towards a specific contractor, but is that something that the industry is considering, or is that something you could get behind? Knowing that I think there's a lot of evidence that this is a big part of the solution is to build a better building. And the hard part about it is we don't have contractors and evaluators in most states to do it.
In Florida, the zoning changed after Andrew, which required a lot of the kinds of things that are in fortified houses. And I think that it's certainly something the industry supports. I think it's politically a difficult thing for the industry. Other comments?
Yeah, I think there absolutely is an appetite for reform in this area. It's complicated in a couple of respects. So I'll start by saying we proactively try to do that. NAMIC's one of the founding partners, along with some other industry folks of the Build Strong Coalition, that seeks these type of reforms. There are some building organizations and builder organizations associated with that. We need more partners in that. But, there are restrictions, understandably so, around steering, around, antitrust behavior where we can't, maybe provide the stick, as you're referencing. But I think driving consumer demand and behavior will follow, and that can help as well. So there's a great deal of appetite for that.
Another question over here?
Yeah, thanks, thanks for taking my question. So I just wanted to say, yeah, Erin, I completely agree with you that this is a housing problem. I worked at the Center for New York City Neighborhoods for like 6 years on their Hurricane Sandy stuff and, developing a home counseling program for folks who were trying to figure out like how to rebuild and the consequences. And yeah, I was really happy to hear about housing codes, because I think, one of the things that I work on right now is convincing the FHA and FHFA to insist on a national, more resilient housing code standard as a condition for financing for any new construction, which is like such an obvious, low-hanging fruit to me. My concern is less insurance profitability, so much as like people not dying in their homes when there's a heat wave and the power goes out. But like, I think it's a similar, ultimately goal, and it would be wonderful to get the insurance industry involved in that. I think we've been talking a lot about California, but I think it's also important. Like we have 50 states and a lot of different regulatory approaches. So if we look at Florida, they have done tort reform. They have, I think, made woke capitalism illegal, whatever that means. They have, a lot of like, they've done a lot of deregulation around this, and insurers are still pulling out. Rates are still going up. And I mean, in this bastion of free market capitalism, the state-run socialist insurance plan is the #1 insurance provider. Is there a point where like the private market just can't, where it's just impossible to actually like meet these needs in a way that is like feasible without, having displacing, hundreds of thousands of people like immediately, which would obviously be kind of a social emergency? Sorry, I know it's a lot of big question.
So, and Florida's at an inflection point in my view. Issues so Florida is uniquely, from a geographical perspective, they're just in a unique spot. So it's not only the challenge of the storms coming through, but then it was the uncertain uncertain litigation on top of that was driving claim costs higher. So you had referenced Citizens being the largest insurer and insurers pulling out. We do now see over the last year, though, new insurers starting and citizen depopulation starting as well. And to me, that just comes down to, can we predict what's going to happen? I think we can predict the storms. What I can not confidently predict is the litigation that comes with it. So as
Yes.
Florida has enacted their reforms.
They have, but
It's
keep in
fine.
mind, litigation is a long tail exposure. It's not an overnight circumstance or situation. I mean, there were anecdotal and fact-based testimonies in that tort reform where we had large insurers say, look, I have 5% of my DWP in Florida, I have 70% of my litigation costs in Florida. And those are not short-term changes, and you had some of these attorneys that were in that system, as soon as the law was passed, flood the airwaves and file 40,000 lawsuits in 3 days. And those things don't go away overnight. So what you are seeing is market correction towards the anticipation of the impact of those reforms, but it takes longer than overnight to realize the impact and virtue of them.
And there's still, I mean, they have relatively low capital requirements for new companies because of this issue. I think it was last year, 7 Florida insurers went out of business. There was not related to any hurricane or storm. It was related to this other issue. So there's a huge sort of guarantee fund issue that has to be paid for when these companies go out of business. There's a huge assessment liability that sits out there for citizens and for the Florida hurricane catastrophe. It is a complicated market that is, I agree, it's at an inflection point, but there's more to come.
Yeah, I think that, as you heard, 7 companies went out of business and there was no big storm, which tells you about the financial regulation and what's allowed. So I think there are a lot of problems that Florida is going to have to confront.
And also follow up to your question, I think we would probably have a lot to talk about in all the points that you made in your question, but I do agree that land use is an important conversation, and building codes, statewide building codes that are enforced is a primary conversation that hopefully we can all get.
So I think we're just about at time. So we have one more.
Yeah,
As the only regulator in the room,
you have to identify yourself.
I sort of say that I think a meaningful conversation can be had with many regulators. I think one of the things, there's a group, the Western Zone is meeting next week to talk about how we can deal with the wildfire issues, because we're all having trouble with it. And one thing that we've been discussing is mitigation. I know in New Mexico, Santa Fe County has put in building codes and is also giving certificates to individual houses. And we're wondering if the insurance industry would be willing to look at that. We're also able to show the house by house, when people come in and say, why can't I get insured? And we can show them, what their vegetation is and what their community is and what some of the issues are. And then we also are obviously talking about the 5-foot rule. Which seems to be really quite amazing in the, I guess one house in Maui survived with the 5-foot, no vegetation. So I think the regulators are willing to talk to the industry, and I think the dialogue needs to be opened up with a lower temperature perhaps than I felt the panel had.
No, I would say, again, it's, there's regulators and there's regulators, right? Like, we're open to talk to
But
all of them.
they're regulators, but there are many regulators that are here trying to solve the
Agreed.
problem. I think if you're having a problem in one particular instance over one particular issue, I think somebody said, don't paint us all with that.
No, exactly. And we, I can just speak for my company, is like, we're very open to speaking with regulators. We're very open to these mitigation conversations. We're very.
I could say as a brand new regulator, it's been hard for us to find out what the industry's doing, where they think the areas of concern are when they're not renewing their head. And I'm there and I'm open and anyone can get a meeting.
We thank you, because we need more regulators with that attitude.
I did come from the industry. But I was a tough general.
On that note, please join me in thanking the panel.